This is a brief training video on how to use documenting the American South to find the slave narrative that you want to evaluate. This is the front page, the home page of this incredibly important database created by the library at the University of North Carolina. An enormously important scholarly contribution in the last few years that's emerged. To begin, you want to go to the menu bar at the top, click Collections, and then scroll down until you see Frederick Douglass's image and the link North American Slave Narratives. As you can see here, there are a number of ways to look through the collection. I highly recommend reading the introduction, and I highly recommend reading Guide to Religious Content in the Slave Narratives. Most of the slave narratives are indeed religious in content, not all, but most are. And that's a significant component in understanding and appreciating them. Probably the easiest way, and the way I recommend first, and in terms of diving into the collection, is to browse the collection alphabetically. So what to look for? Well, again, as I've said in the video and the lecture, you want to think about what kind of slave narrative do you want to write about. For example, do you want to write one by a woman? Do you want to write one by a man? Do you want to write one that's fairly dramatic? Are you interested in one that's very spiritual and religious in content? There are all sorts of interesting ways to think about how to search for your slave narrative. What I recommend doing first is simply to do what we call skim. It's as if you're in the library itself and you're just picking up books and skimming. One way to skim is to look at titles. For example, A Thrilling Sketch of the Life of the Distinguished Chief Oka Tubi, alias William Chubby. This is an interesting title because it suggests that he had mixed Native American and African American blood. Some of the titles are very prosaic. For example, interesting account of Thomas Anderson, a slave, taken from his own lips. Some are very dramatic. For example, you see this very long one here. Some of the slave titles are indeed very, very long. This one here is A History of the Amistad Captives. Perhaps you've heard of the movie Amistad, directed by Steven Spielberg. Again, another way is to search for a slave narrative written by a woman if you're interested in that. I happen to know where there is one right off the bat, so we'll just scroll down here to the V's. And I'll use this example to talk about what to look for in your slave narrative and some of the things you're going to want to include in your narrative. Bethany Veeney. Obviously, Bethany's a woman. In fact, a slave woman is in the title itself. So we see here it was published in Worcester, Massachusetts. Most of the slave narratives were published in the North. We see that it was published in 1889, so that tells us it's a postbellum narrative. And this is another way of thinking about what kind of narrative you want to choose. This one is 46 pages. That's not very long. Some of them are quite long. Some of them are 400 pages. Some are medium length at 130 pages. Some are quite short, like Bethany Veeney's or this one below her, 36 pages. So if you don't have a lot of time on your hands, maybe you're going to be looking at your selection from a very practical point of view. I don't recommend choosing a narrative that's only say 23 pages or 10 pages, simply because you're being asked to write a 3 to 4 page evaluation. So we'll just click on slave narrative, the narrative of Bethany Veeney, a slave woman. And again, you have the title, you have the original publication date. And if you click the HTML file, that will take you to the actual book, the electronic book. This first set of information is the electronic information. When the library first made it into an electronic format. So we'll just scroll down and we see an image of the cover, the actual book. This is called Front Matter, so there was a picture of Bethany Veeney herself. We have the title, The Narrative of Bethany Veeney, a Slave Woman, with other kinds of introductory materials, such as the introduction by Reverend Bishop Malley Liu, and another prefatory preface by Reverend Erastus Spalding. So we have those before we even get to the narrative itself. There's an image of the cover page. Again, we scroll down, there's our introduction, there's our preface, and then finally begins the story of Bethany Veeney herself. In your evaluation, if you find this prefatory material interesting and or particularly relevant, that would be something to write about. Most of it, though, is not that interesting, quite frankly. It's simply setting up the book. So here begins the actual narrative. We see that it's written in first person. I have but little recollection of my early life. When you are quoting and you're including page numbers, this is the actual page number from the actual book. So it's as if you have the book right here in front of you. Okay? And you'll see that the chapters here are pretty short. Again, it's a short narrative, so the chapters are short. Each chapter title, in this case, gives us a pretty clear idea of what the chapter is about. And so let's say I'm skimming through this and I'm finding it very interesting. It's of a medium length. It's very practical in terms of length. It's by a woman, which is perhaps what I want to be the guiding force in my selection. So this is perhaps the narrative I'm going to choose for my narrative evaluation. Usually it doesn't happen that fast. And again, I knew who Bethany Veeney was. I've read this. I've taught it before. It'll be very beneficial for you just to sort of skim through the collection. For example, I'm guessing most of you have heard of Sojourner Truth. Perhaps you've always wanted to know more about Sojourner Truth. Here it is. Here's her slave narrative, which you could write about. You will see down here the Confessions of Nat Turner, very famous slave who led a slave revolt and was hanged. And fortunately, just before he was hanged, a journalist interviewed him, and we have this narrative. You'll see all sorts of interesting titles, names you're familiar with. And again, these are just ways of helping you find the narrative that you want. Let me show you one more. It's the narrative of Box Brown. Let's see. Here we are, the narrative of Henry Box Brown. So you probably think, oh, that's an interesting name. Why would his name be Box? And we click on the image and we see a cover of the frontispiece. And in fact, this is how Henry Brown escaped slavery. He escaped in a box on a ship. If you think that looks rather harrowing, I'm sure it really was. This is a really interesting slave narrative for that reason and other reasons. So again, these are just a few ways of thinking about how to find your slave narrative. Obviously, too, you can email me, call me. But at any rate, I hope this helps.